heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
All right. That's not totally true. It's just Margison today, and Spears is on vacation, actually. If you happen to follow him on Twitter, you might know that. It's really obnoxious. So it's like 40 degrees here in central Indiana, and Spears keeps posting these pictures of like crystal blue water and sunshine and what have you. Well, at least somebody is here working. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side. Again, I am just Mr. Margison, and we want to thank you for listening. A lot of different ways that you can listen to this show. Google Play Store, iTunes, Spreaker, that's Spreaker with an R, our YouTube channel, Mike Justin. All of our previously recorded episodes are listed on any of those platforms. We want to give special thanks to the Cerberus Radio Network for broadcasting our show nightly. We also want to give thanks to WCVL. If you are here in West Central Indiana, that's 92.1 FM, 1550 AM, or WCVLAM.com. You can hear us there every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. So here we go. Today we're going to be talking about Columbus Day, Thanksgiving, and misinformation. That's the title of this episode. And we just had Columbus Day last week, and Thanksgiving is coming up in about a month. And unfortunately, it's become fashionable in schools today to use these 2 days to spread a bunch of bogus misinformation to kids. And one story that I came across that kind of stuck with me, and this was a number of years ago, but it's an elementary school teacher in Seattle who came in on it would have been Thanksgiving, I guess the day before Thanksgiving or previously that week. But anyway, he came in and he was wearing a big pilgrim hat, and he then proceeded to take the kids' backpacks and take their crayons and their glue sticks and all of their possessions. And essentially, this is the way that he chose to introduce kids to Native American European interactions, which, of course, is a very complex issue that spans many centuries and is a little bit more involved than just grabbing the possessions of a few impressionable young kids, stealing them and leaving it at that. He also found it appropriate to sully some innocent kids' image of a likely positive holiday for them. And then in some schools, when you get to the older grades, they've been teaching instead a national day of mourning. In fact, I remember this being talked about when I was going through grad school way back in 2003, 2004, something like that. Yeah, they talked about not celebrating Thanksgiving and how inappropriate that was, and instead to teach a national day of mourning. I've heard about that in some places, but rather than talk about Thanksgiving holiday, and this has actually been a thing, if you're not aware, indigenous groups, not all indigenous groups, but some indigenous, especially activist groups, celebrate instead a national day of mourning. You can look that up rather than Thanksgiving holiday. But this is what happens if your child gets a fresh out of college idiot to educate them. They are told that this instead is real education. And look, I have no problem with teaching things as they actually happened. I think that's what you're supposed to do if you're a teacher. But I have a big problem with teaching lies, especially to my kids. And that'll be the focus of today's episode. What many of our kids are taught with respect to European Native American relations are based on two very destructive, outright lies. And I want to correct them, or at least help correct them, or as we say here, at least give you the other side of what is taught. So the first one is the lie that whites committed genocide against native populations. And this is pretty common to say. I want to read some. There's this one website I go to, and they kind of make fun of these leftists who come unhinged during the Thanksgiving holiday. Well, they make fun of leftists all the time, but during the Thanksgiving holiday, they compile a bunch of tweets that that come out, and A lot of these are hashtag Happy Genocide Day. So this one says, no thanks, no giving. What are you celebrating? Hashtag Thanksgiving, hashtag tag genocide. Next one says, I feel like saying you hate Thanksgiving is similar to saying you hate baby animals, but I hate Thanksgiving and I love baby animals. And then as a thread to that, somebody said, considering the true origins of Thanksgiving and all the lovely genocide involved, I think hating Thanksgiving makes sense. Here is another one that says, oh, good, Thanksgiving. Awesome. The original celebration for white supremacy and cultural genocide. And another one which says, I say, quote, Happy Genocide Day instead of Thanksgiving. Another one, I can't wait to remind everyone at dinner tomorrow that Thanksgiving is based off a genocide. Next one, another year where this country prepares to celebrate genocide. And again, people will defend it on the premise of tradition. There are a few more here, but I think that you get the point. Genocide is often repeated. And that I think needs to be corrected. Now, it's absolutely true that the vast majority of natives died after European arrival, but that was almost all due to disease. Smallpox and other infections like influenza and measles, to which the Europeans were immune to, created plagues that ran rampant throughout the Americas, especially up the Atlantic coast and down across the South. And one statistic that I came across stated that over 95% of natives in present day Massachusetts died from this plague. And this is sad. It's tragic. It's unfortunate, but it is not genocide. You have to think about what that word means. And if we are going to call this genocide, then we have to look at other plagues. We would have to look at the third pandemic in China that killed 12 million Chinese, and then call the Central and Southwest Asians murderers or genocidal maniacs. And that one, it even traveled and ravaged India. It even got so far as to San Francisco in the early 20th century. And we can go back further in history and we can look at the Black Plague in Europe, which killed 75 million worldwide in the 14th century. And are we supposed to call the Mongols or the Kurds guilty of genocide? I mean, they're the ones who carried it. That would seem absurd today. And I'm pretty sure that in Mongol schools or in Kurg schools, they don't sit there and kind of self-deprecate and go through these self-criticism sessions where they talk about how they created genocide against Europeans of the 14th century. That would be unreasonable. One of the side effects of diffusion and globalization and travel and trade, unfortunately, are these pandemics. That's been consistent throughout history. They've occurred everywhere as long as people have been traveling, and it's just silly to shame Europeans for bringing a plague here. And to further debunk the notion of genocide, in many cases, some of the most powerful native societies were wiped out before contact with Europeans was even made. What you have, the disease outpaced the people. It reached villages that whites had not yet encountered, and it decimated these villages. And that's just because this particular strain, it was so easily passed, it literally was able to outpace the people who were carrying it. And on that note, I also have to talk about a widely held myth that smallpox blankets were deliberately used against natives. That is not true. It's false. It's fake news. There was a book that I read. It came out about 10 years ago, and I encourage you to read it as well. It's called 10 Big Lies About America. And the author, Michael Medved, who's also a syndicated radio talk show host, um, he talked about his interview with a woman named Elizabeth Fenn, who was the author of a book called Pax Americana, subtitled The Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1775 to 1782. She's also the world's leading expert on the American impact of this dreaded disease. And when he asked her whether her years of research had turned up any persuasive evidence that germ warfare tactics contributed to Indian victimization, her answer was, quote, frankly, no, end quote. This uh, story comes from a postscript in a letter between two British generals, where one of them broached the topic of a blanket being infected with smallpox and then making its way into a Native American village. But the idea that this ever actually happened, first of all, the idea that anybody understood germ theory at this time is just ridiculous. Nobody was quite that sophisticated scientifically to understand that the disease could be passed this way. People didn't know this. But there's also no evidence that it actually happened. Yet it's unbelievable. So many of our kids, at least even I grew up thinking that smallpox blankets were an actual thing. So the point here is that even when the idea of genocide is when it's realized that okay, yes, most Native Americans did not die at the sword or at the gun; they died because of the disease. Then it just gets turned into a different lie. Well, oh yeah, then well, the disease was purposeful, and I need to tell you that's just not true. And one last thing on this subject: students are often brought up to believe that natives kind of lived in this pristine environment before these dirty, wretched Europeans showed up. That's also false. I read a pretty interesting report here. Um, Oh, I might have gotten out of this tab. Anyway, the report was from oh yeah, here it is. The U.S. National Library of Medicine from the National Institute of Health. It's in the Western Journal of Medicine. So this is a legitimate source, and it's titled "Health Conditions Before Columbus: Paleopathology of Native North Americans." And it was actually a very interesting read, believe it or not. But the recent paleopathological data on the bones and the teeth of thousands of natives, on the remains of thousands of natives, showed that they were actually in a state of declining health for several centuries, up to a millennia before the Europeans actually got there. And this may help explain why the plagues which hit them were so deadly. Some of the theories there are that there was an over reliance on maize, and so then therefore not enough protein, and this results in low iron, which weakens the immune system. And but the point here is this: if you want to tell a story about a plague, tell a story about a plague. Don't take an instance of a plague and tell kids it's a story of genocide. It's not just bad history, it's disingenuous, it's dishonest, and misleading to a highly influential audience, and that's inappropriate. Okay, misdirection number 2. See, I'm being nicer now. I'm not even calling them lies. I'm calling them misdirections. Is that the natives were peaceful and the Europeans were violent. And this, again, is just bad history. Or I guess it's rather oversimplified history or incomplete history to help satisfy a leftist agenda of convincing kids that Americans or Europeans, or I mean, really anyone with white skin. That's really what it's been reduced to now. It's how pathetic is it? It's just skin color. But anybody in that ilk, they're just terrible people. And so anything they do is terrible, even if it mirrors exactly actions of another group that is not European or American. I know that was confusing, but look, here's my simple thesis. The natives who occupied this land prior to European arrival were just as warlike, just as violent, and competed for territory just as fiercely as the Europeans did. And there is nothing that makes it uniquely terrible just because the Europeans had a different skin color or because they crossed an ocean. There's something about that fact, the fact that they crossed an ocean, that really seems to offend people. It's as if they had, if they had crossed over land or a lake or a river, it wouldn't be quite so egregious. I mean, here in the Midwest, Plains Indians fought all the time because some land was better than others and some had more buffalo, and that was desirable. But somehow that's different, right? That's fine. There's no need to tell that story. If you look different and cross an ocean, well, that's just an act of pure evil. And look, let me be clear here. This is not a defense of the conquistadors, who I think were probably some really scummy individuals by everything I've been able to read. But where's the value in bending history to make a story seem different than it actually is? What's the point of that? It bastardizes history, and as someone who teaches history, that really annoys me. So let's look at some of the history of pre Columbian natives that I was able to come across. And this is not just some ridiculous blog post. I'm getting this from the Oxford Companion to American Military History. And this is a section on Native American wars and specifically warfare in Native American societies pre-Columbus, right? We're talking about pre-Columbian times. And some people who have studied this, you may know that the Eastern woodland cultures were maybe not violent, but a little bit more warlike than some of the other Native American populations here. And so I'm picking up here in the middle of this passage. It says, quote, among the more densely populated Eastern woodland cultures, warfare often served as a means of coping with grief and depopulation. Such conflict, commonly known as a mourning war, usually began at the behest of women who had lost a son or husband and desired the group's male warriors to capture individuals from other groups who could replace those they had lost. Seriously? I mean, this is okay? If you didn't catch that, rather than fight for territory, if a woman had lost a son or a husband, she would go and she would convince the males in that particular tribe to just go capture some other guys from another tribe and bring them back. And it gets worse here. Captives might help maintain a stable population or appease the grief of bereaved relatives. If the woman of the tribe so demanded, captives would be ritually tortured, sometimes to death, if the captives were deemed unfit for adoption into this tribe. This, it seems to me, is a story that could be told if we're going to talk about violent action. I mean, capturing people from another tribe because you lost somebody, enslaving them, and then, hey, it turns out I don't like them. Should we let them go? No, let's just torture them to death. Because the aim in warfare was to acquire captives, quick raids as opposed to long pitched battles predominated. Warfare in Eastern woodland cultures also allowed young males to acquire prestige or status through the demonstration of martial skill and courage. Conflicts among these groups thus stemmed as much from internal social reasons as from external relations with neighbors. Look, the point of this is to debunk the idea that these were peaceful cultures and then all of a sudden some violent Europeans come in. All right, that's Eastern woodlands. Let's move on to the Western plains. Western plains, pre-Columbian warfare, before the introduction of horses and guns, pitted tribes against one another for control of territory and its resources. Okay, so these wars did have a different aim, all right, much more like the wars of European conquest. They were for control of territory and resources, as well, though, as for captives and honor. Indian forces marched on foot to attack rival tribes who sometimes resided in palisaded villages. Before the arrival of horse and gun, battles could last days and casualties could number in the hundreds. Thereafter, both Plains and Indian culture and the character and meaning of war changed dramatically. So we're talking about after horse and guns came into the picture. The horse facilitated quick, long distance raids to acquire goods. Warfare became more individualistic and less bloody, an opportunity for adolescent males to acquire prestige through demonstrations of courage. It became more honorable for a warrior to touch his enemy or steal his horse than to kill him. Actually, what we're seeing in the plains is that the introduction of guns and horses created fewer deaths among intertribal warfare with the Plains Indians. That probably not something that's often talked about. And then it goes on to say that, it's a little bit more negligible in the Southwest. You don't see quite as much warfare, though, although anthropologists found mass graves numbering in the hundreds, where not only men, but women and children had axe wounds to the head, they had spear wounds to the chest. Um, and particularly violent episodes. Okay, so what's the point? The point is that the arrival of Europeans and what they did is simply no different than what had been going on in the Americas for centuries before they did arrive. There were plenty of instances of peace and plenty of instances of war. And that actually can probably describe like 99% of all societies across human history. Yet academics in this country, they want to change history and make Thanksgiving into a day of mourning and self guilt for our school children. It's insanity. So, real quickly, in closing on this, I want to talk about two events where the bias is just overwhelming. And um, it's going to be the story of the Aztecs and then also the Pequot Wars. Now, I chose these because the Aztecs and the Pequot Wars were two of the most or actually the Aztecs and just the Pequots, not the wars, but they were two most dominant tribes of their time and place. And how did they achieve that status? Well, it wasn't exactly through peace. And so what I did is, I just out of curiosity, I went to some websites for school children on these topics because I don't have books on them in front of me. And so a lot of times what teachers do now is rather than go directly to a textbook, they'll also go to online sources. You can just Google, Aztecs for kids or whatever, and all sorts of websites will pop up. But what I found interesting is just like listen to the language that's used to describe the Aztecs, used to describe the Pequots, and then used to describe the Europeans who came later. So Aztecs, they were called a fierce tribe of warriors. They talk about their brilliant cities and all of their artwork and so on and so forth. The Pequots were referred to as powerful, fierce, brave, well organized. With these two tribes, when they actually take over other tribes, which they did frequently, but it's never phrased that way. Instead, what we see is we see words like conquer and consolidate and grow. Or, here is my favorite, sacrifice. They talk about Aztec sacrifices, which I guess is one way of putting it. If you capture a soldier from another tribe and then cut their chest cavity open while they're still alive and rip out their heart, that's a sacrifice. I don't know. Some people might call it murder. Um, but then if you look on these same websites and let's look at how they talk about the European conquistadors. They use the term steal and murder and trick and greedy. Uh, talk specifically about how they trick them into stealing gold. Here's a little sub passage I found there. This is a kid's website, and it talks about the conquistadors. And it says here, within a short time, the world of the Aztecs and the Incas was destroyed, their temples ruined, and their emperors murdered. And then it has like a little kind of inset on the page here, and it says "Conquest for Gold!" exclamation part. To trick the native people into giving them treasure, the Spanish invaders told them they had a disease of the heart that could only be cured with gold. And if the people couldn't be tricked, the conquistadors just took the gold by force, killing anyone who wouldn't hand it over. And the Spanish king took 1/5 of all the treasure the conquistadors stole. Look, again, this is not to defend the conquistadors, whose actions I think are probably indefensible or certainly indefensible, especially when it comes to just, the blatant and outright killing. But there is very little value in, you want to talk about tricking. This is what educators are doing to kids today when they misrepresent history to propagate an agenda that they have. And look, often it doesn't come from the teachers because the teachers are often just dupes of leftist academics who tricked them in college. And essentially, what you're having the academics, the college professors, end up tricking these kids. But there is a larger agenda here where the more you can, I suppose, get kids to believe that America is a terrible place, well, then you can take some of the foundations that go along with it, most notably capitalism and free enterprise and laissez faire, and you can get people to destroy that too. And this is the reason that you see so many young people today when they protested throwing bricks through the window of a Starbucks or carrying around signs that say capitalism kills. They actually have no idea what they're doing, or they have no idea what they're talking about. But this is just what they've been led to believe. All right, let me finish up here on the Aztecs in the Pequot. So, anyway, the larger point here is when these books talk about Aztecs, they talk about them as, dominant or conquering. But what the Aztecs did to the native tribes around them was the exact same thing that the Europeans did to the Aztecs. It's just on a different scale from a group with different colored skin who came across an ocean. That seems to be the dividing line between okay and not okay for whatever arbitrary reason. But there's literally no difference. And then if we talk about the Pequot Wars, one of the things that is kind of beat into school children's head when they become juniors and they take U.S. history is this Mystic Massacre. Not only is it pretty prevalent in the textbooks, but I remember uh, probably about 10 years ago, PBS did a special on the Mystic Massacre, and the History Channel did a special on the Mystic Massacre. And it just shows how horribly brutal and bloody it was. And effectively, what happened here is you had a English colonist, Captain John Mason, went to a Pequot fort and burned it. And then the escapees were summarily shot as they tried to come out. I mean, it was a disgusting, despicable, brutal act. And what the end result was like 500 dead Pequot men, women, and children. Very, very few managed to escape, and the ones that actually did escape the fire again were shot. And I think there were only like 7 who escaped totally, and that they were brought captive. But this is what is used as like the defining evidence that the Europeans were brutal and the native tribes were peaceful. And again, you have to zoom out just a little bit in order to get the real truth. And the point here is that what the Pequot did to the tribes around them was, I don't want to say it's no different, because burning somebody and then shooting them as they came out is pretty brutal. But you have instances of murdering and scalping. And look, the Pequots, they didn't just acquire their territory in Connecticut. Again, the websites describe them as well, what powerful, fierce, brave, well organized. That's just a way of saying that the Pequots were able to conquer territory that wasn't originally theirs, and they did that. And they took over areas around these Connecticut valleys. Let me try and find here specifically. I lost the page, but the Narragansetts and the Mahogany, um, they were able to take, or excuse me, Mahogany, Mohegans, they were able to take from Algonquins, Wampanoags. The Pequots were able to go through, and because they had a superior military, and they were all of these things. They were fierce, brave, and well organized, but they were just better equipped to kill than some of the other tribes were. And one of the ways that they were able to acquire that territory is to do it through violent use of force. And you hear so much today about, oh, well, we have to return land, stolen land from the Native American, from the whites back to the Native Americans. Well, then which tribe are you going to give it to? Once we do that, let's say that we do decide to return, for instance, Connecticut, from the white people to the Native Americans. Well, how far do we take this back? Do we go through and do we then return it? No, we can't give it to the Pequot, because the Pequot took it from people who originally, from tribes who originally inhabited that area. And who knows that were who though if there was any conflict from those tribes. The mobilization and movement and conflict, and then settling of boundaries. This is something that has happened for thousands and thousands of years, all the way across the globe throughout history. And I think the obsessive focus that we tend to have on this particular episode, this is a lot like what Justin and I talked about in our episode on slavery that we did probably 2 months ago. Right? Slavery, again, is a worldwide institution. It's an institution that has existed since the beginning of human history, and it's done in every corner and every society in the globe. Yet, so many kids are under the impression that slavery is unique to the United States. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I believe that many, many kids are under the impression that what the Europeans did when they came over here, well, not to be commended at all and not to be celebrated. And again, let me say this. I don't think that Columbus Day should be celebrated. I'll get to that in a second. It's not to be celebrated, but it is not unique. It is something that has happened, and it is another piece of history, is another piece of conquering in history that has determined boundaries. And I have no problem with teaching it, but teach it within a larger conquest. Real quick on Columbus Day, I do think that the celebration of Columbus Day is well, purposeless. I don't see any value inside. He had virtually nothing to do with uh, America or the founding of America, and I think this was largely lobbied by Italian immigrant groups who I don't know why. I guess it's because he's Italian. He sailed for the Spanish, but I'm not one of these who thinks that we should, you know, worship Columbus, and I don't think his statues are quite necessary. And I really, as much as I hate the bringing down of statues, and as purposeless as that is as an activity, the bringing down of a Columbus statue doesn't affect me at all. All right, let me see if there's anything else that I haven't gotten to. No, that's pretty much it. I've made it through my notes. So, look, what as you go through this holiday season, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to pay special attention to what my kids bring home, and I want to make sure that whatever they get the correct story. And I really don't see much value in my boys suffering through some sort of guilt for something that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I want them to enjoy Thanksgiving Day, and people should celebrate Thanksgiving Day in whatever way they seem appropriate. But we are not going to hang our heads in sorrow. We're going to enjoy it as a family, and I hope you do too. Justin will be back in the next episode. And as I alluded to last week, we only have a few of these left, and we're going to be hitting education, moving away from history and hitting education pretty hard then. I want to thank everybody for listening. Again, I want to thank the Cerberus Radio Network for putting us on, and I want to thank WCVL over in Crawfordsville for putting us on. And to all of you, we thank you. You have now heard the other side.